Welcome to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, our journey begins not with the gleam of a throne, but with its long, deep shadow. We travel to a kingdom nestled by a great lake, a body of water so vast it seems to hold the sky captive during the day, only to release a breathtaking blanket of stars at night. Imagine the air here, thick with the scent of wet papyrus, the sweet perfume of blooming water lilies, and the dark, rich aroma of fertile earth. This is a land of plenty. The queen of this magnificent realm is named Nile, which means rain in the old tongue. A name given to her because her birth marked the end of a devastating 7-year drought. She is the life giver, the promise of renewal. But tonight, the scent carried on the wind is different. Beneath the familiar notes of lotus and mud, there is something new, something unsettling. A distant, metallic taps of fear hangs in the air, and far off on the horizon, the faint glow of cooking fires that do not belong to her people. Conquest is coming. It's not arriving as a sudden, violent storm, but as a slow, tightening vine, creeping insidiously toward the very heart of the palace. It is in these moments, when darkness gathers, that royalty is truly tested. The test is not how brightly it shines, but how effectively it can disappear, how it can fold its brilliant light into the mundane, how it can whisper its sacred laws in the simple language of the commoner. This is a story of metamorphosis. It is the story of a queen learning that her most sacred duty is not to die upon her throne, but to smuggle the very idea of her throne to safety in something as humble as a basket of woven reeds. Let's pause for a moment. Listen. The fire crackles gently beside us as the night breathes softly all around. Imagine the weight of a crown, not resting on your brow, but held in your hands, cold, heavy, brilliant with history and power. Now, imagine having to make a choice that will define everything. Do you wear it into glorious oblivion, a final, defiant act? Or do you take it apart, bead by precious bead, and hide its radiant light in the hem of a servant's dress? This is the very choice that hangs in the scented night air of Queen Nile's kingdom. A choice between the symbol and the substance, between a glorious end and an uncertain future. This story is about so much more than a simple escape. It is a story of observation, of a queen learning to see her world through the eyes of those who are so often invisible. It is a story of ingenious disguise, where the sacred geometry of the kingdom, its very soul, is hidden in plain sight within the patterns of market baskets. It is a tale of a silent, barefoot walk away from everything she has ever known, guided only by the terrible, heart-wrenching music of her own palace being claimed by strangers. The sounds of celebration that are not for her, echoing across the water. And finally, it is the story of a rebirth on a lonely shore. It's about how a kingdom can be rebuilt, not with gold and stone, but with driftwood, with seashells, and with stories told in the delicate patterns of fish bones drawn on the sand. It's about preserving a culture, not in monuments, but in memory and in the telling. So, I invite you to settle into the warmth of our fire, the warmth that pushes back the cool, damp air of the lake night. Let go of your ideas of fixed power and glittering, unchanging courts. We are about to witness a different kind of strength, a more profound power. The strength that knows how to become small, how to bend without breaking. The strength that knows how to carry an entire world in a simple woven cage, and how to find the courage to plant it again in the most unexpected and perhaps the most fertile soil. Thank you for joining us under the Baobab Skies. Welcome back to our series, where we explore the hidden arts of power and strategy. Today, we delve into a foundational principle. To save a kingdom, you must first unlearn the gaze of a ruler and master the unnoticed vision of the ruled. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why this shift in perspective is the most powerful weapon a leader can possess. Imagine the Queen's chamber. It's a world of cool silence, its walls lined with carved mahogany. The air is forever scented with beeswax and sandalwood oil. This was Queen Niall's world. From her balcony, she had always viewed her domain as a vast, living tapestry. She saw the ordered geometry of tilled fields, the winding paths leading to lakeshore villages, and the smoke from 100 peaceful hearths rising straight into the still air. It was a view of belonging, of her own benevolent oversight. It was the picture of a world she commanded and protected. But the view had changed. Drastically, now, from that very same balcony, she watched that beautiful tapestry being frayed at its edges. Dark, disordered smudges of smoke now marred the horizon, blotting out the familiar landscape. The straight, disciplined columns of her own warriors, once a symbol of order at the distant gates, were gone. In their place, a chaotic swarm of besiegers' camps sprawled across the land. The view from her balcony, once a source of pride and peace, had become a panorama of ending. It was a portrait of her failure. It was her elder Mathone who found her there at dawn, lost in the despair of that sight. Mathone was not a royal by birth, but by a wisdom so profound it commanded more respect than any crown. She had been a diplomatic gift from a neighboring kingdom decades ago, sent as part spy, part counselor. Over the years, she had become more grandmother to Niall than servant. She took Niall's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, dry and tough like an old vine. "Come, child of the rain," she said, using a private name that reached past the Queen to the young woman within. "The balcony is for showing the face of power. But to save that power, you must now see with its unseen eyes. Follow me." Mathone didn't lead Niall to the War Council, with its maps and loud, desperate arguments from her generals. Instead, she led her deeper into the bowels of the palace, down a narrow, spiraling staircase. The stone steps were worn smooth, hollowed by generations of bare feet carrying linens, water, and firewood. They emerged not in a grand hall, but in a cramped, dusty gallery high in the western wall. This was a place Niall had never been. It was lined with tiny, unglazed windows, little more than slits in the stone, used by the laundry women to judge the weather for drying clothes. Niall Mathone instructed, her voice soft but firm. Without question, Queen Niall knelt on the rough-hewn wooden floor. The movement was awkward in her royal silks. The small window was now exactly at the height of her eyes. The view she got was not the sweeping panorama from her balcony. It was a slice, a fragment of the world outside. She couldn't see the whole battlefield, not even close. She could only see a portion of the western approach, a segment of the enemy's rear lines. But what she saw in that limited frame was utterly different. It was detail. It was pattern. From her grand balcony, the enemy was a terrifying, formless swarm, a force of nature. But from this humble window, she saw not a swarm, but a routine, a specific group of men gathered at a specific cookfire at a specific time each morning. She realized it was the changing of a guard shift. She saw young boys, no older than her own stable hands, leading goats to the same thorny bush to graze every single day. She saw the lazy, predictable route of a patrol that always skirted a muddy patch of ground they clearly disliked walking through. Through this servant's window, she saw the enemy not as some monstrous, overwhelming force, but as a collection of individuals. They were tired, bored, habit-bound men. They were predictable, they had routines, preferences, and moments of inattention, just like her own people. Mathone's voice was a whisper beside her, cutting through the dawn stillness. "A ruler sees the forest," she said. "A servant sees the trees. She sees the roots, the path of the ants between them. The ants are not concerned with who owns the forest. They know only their path, their food, their hill. To move unseen through a forest, you must think like an ant, not a lion. In that moment, everything shifted for Nile. She understood. Her royal gaze, the one she was trained for her entire life, the one that sought the grand picture, the sweeping strategy, that gaze was now a liability. It only created fear and a sense of helplessness in the face of an overwhelming enemy. The servant's gaze, on the other hand, was narrow, pragmatic, and focused. It revealed mechanics. It revealed vulnerabilities. It revealed routines. It showed her a world not of unstoppable force, but of manageable gaps and predictable rhythms. It showed her a path. To save her kingdom, she had to stop being its lion, roaring from the high balcony. She had to learn to be its most clever, most unnoticed aunt. She had to learn to see the small paths that the powerful overlook. The first, most critical lesson in saving her kingdom was the humility of vision. The real education, the education of the unseen, had just begun. This story teaches us a profound truth about leadership and problem solving. Whether you're leading a company, a team, or just navigating your own life's challenges, the balcony view can be paralyzing. It shows us the scale of the problem, which can feel insurmountable. But by adopting the servant's view, by getting down on the ground and looking at the details, the patterns, the routines, that's where we find the cracks. That's where we find the leverage points for real change. It's not about abandoning the big picture, but about understanding that the big picture is made up of countless small, manageable details. That's where strategy is born. For 3 long days, Nile made her home in the cramped servants' gallery of the besieged palace. It was a bleak existence, with only a mat for a bed, a gourd of water for drink, and a clay bowl of cold roasted yams for sustenance. But she wasn't just surviving. She was a student. She was dedicating herself to a new, terrible science, the science of the invader's boredom. It was a study in human weakness, a search for the cracks in the armor of a vastly superior force. She wasn't alone in her vigil. Mathone, an elder whose wisdom was etched into the lines of her face, joined her. The old woman became her interpreter, her guide to the silent, unspoken language of the enemy camp below. "See there," Mathone would murmur, her voice a dry rustle of leaves, pointing with a bent, knowing finger through the narrow window. "The tall one, the one with the red cloth tied to his spear. He is their Minamoti, their captain of the night. He inspects the posts every day, just as the morning star begins to fade. He is a man of rigid consistency. He likes his tea first, always. Watch his fire." And Nile watched. She committed every detail to memory. She saw the captain emerge from his tent at the same time each dawn, stretching his long limbs before making his way to a specific cooking fire. A young boy always had a clay pot steaming, ready for him. The captain would drink his tea, then begin his rounds. His path was a perfect, predictable loop around the camp's perimeter. "A man of habit is a man you can predict," Mathone whispered, her words sinking deep into Nile's understanding. "His habit is a door he leaves unlocked for you." Together they began to map time. Not by the sun's steady arc across the sky, but by the enemy's mundane rituals. The changing of the guard wasn't marked by a clanging bell, but by the moment the shadow of the great fig tree touched a particular sun-bleached rock. The main patrol didn't depart on a schedule, but when the smell of roasting maize from the central camp grew strong, signaling the midday meal, they even identified individual weaknesses. A particular sentry, stationed at the foul-smelling midden gate, had a perpetually irritable look on his face. Every afternoon, shortly after his relief arrived, lulled by the oppressive heat and the lazy buzzing of flies from the refuse pile, he would doze off. His nap was short, but reliable, lasting for a count of exactly 200 breaths. Niall started keeping a mental ledger, a detailed catalogue of the camp's lifeblood. She noted the comings and goings of the supply donkeys, their laden backs a sign of the enemy's confidence. She learned to distinguish the patterns of laughter from different sections of the camp, the boisterous roars from the gambling soldiers, the nervous chuckles from the newly arrived recruits. She pinpointed the times when the general noise of the camp dipped. It happened twice a day, once during the peak heat of the afternoon, and again in the deepest dark of the night, right before dawn, when men were at their most weary, their attention stretched thin. "They are not watching us," Mathone observed one afternoon, her voice filled with a kind of grim satisfaction. They watched a group of soldiers gambling with pebbles, their backs turned completely to the palace walls they were supposed to be guarding. "They are waiting for us to surrender. They have grown complacent. They are bored." Mathone's insight was sharp as a shard of obsidian. Bored men see only what is directly in front of them, and only if it moves in a threatening way. They have forgotten how to see stillness. They have forgotten the meaning in a woman carrying a basket or a child leading a goat. To them, we are not individuals anymore. We are just categories, the conquered, the defeated. This was the second, and perhaps most crucial, lesson. The psychology of occupation. The conquerors, so confident in their superior numbers and firepower, had shifted their mindset. They had moved from a state of acute, high-strung alertness to a dull, vigilant routine. Their senses were now attuned only to the obvious threats, the threat of soldiers storming the gates, of surprise sorties, of the blare of trumpet blasts signaling a counterattack. They had become deaf and blind to the quiet, constant hum of daily survival, the very rhythm that defined life for Niall and her people. And it was this rhythm, this illusion of the mundane, that Niall needed to mimic to become invisible. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine being in that dusty, cramped gallery. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of their own unwashed bodies, and the distant, alien sense of the enemy's cook fires drifting on the breeze. Niall's eyes are dry and burning from hours of staring. Her knees ache from crouching on the hard floor, but her mind has never been sharper. She's not just looking, she's reading. She is learning to read a new, living clock, one whose gears are the habits of men and whose chime is the sound of their distraction. By the end of the third day, a profound transformation had occurred. Niall could close her eyes and recite the daily cycle of the Camp S. Western approach with the same clarity she once recited the lineages of her ancestors. The knowledge was now part of her, ingrained and absolute. She knew that the irritable sentry snap was their best window of opportunity at the Midden Gate. She knew the captain's ritualistic tea time created a brief but critical focal point of attention away from the outer defenses. She knew that the noisy gambling session by the old well provided a perfect blanket of sound, a cacophony that could cover the small, careful movements of someone trying to slip past unnoticed. She had learned to see time not as a continuous line, but as a path filled with gaps. She learned to see the enemy's vigilance not as a solid wall, but as a wave that crests and then inevitably falls. The enemy's day was no longer a monolithic, impenetrable wall of threat. It had been broken down into a sequence of doors. Most were bolted shut, but some, she now realized, were slightly ajar. And the key to slipping through those ajar doors wasn't brute force. It wasn't a spear or a sword. The key was mimicry. It was about moving with the rhythm of the mundane, becoming a part of the very landscape of boredom that the invaders themselves had created. A plan was beginning to form in her mind. It wasn't a military strategy with battle lines and troop movements. It was more like a performance, a piece of theater, It was a performance of profound, unremarkable ordinariness. And in that ordinariness, she would find her freedom. Knowing your enemy's rhythm is one thing, but having a body that can move to that rhythm is another entirely. Queen Nile's body was a perfect testament to her high station. Her skin, anointed daily with sai butter and coconut oil, was smooth and completely unblemished, the beautiful color of dark honey. Her hands were long-fingered, with nails kept impeccably clean and oval, having never touched anything harsher than the stem of a ceremonial fly whisk or the delicate pages of a holy book. Her posture was always erect, her walk a measured, gliding pace that conveyed both authority and grace. These were the signatures of her power, and now they were all death sentences. Mathone took charge of the unmaking. In a small, windowless storeroom that smelled of dried herbs and dust, she began the difficult work. First, the hands. She had Nile plunge them into a basin of water mixed with the ash of specific bitter barks and the crushed leaves of the morabayan tree. This will stain and dry the skin, Mathone explained, as Nile winced at the astringent bite. It will make it look weathered, like you have washed clothes in the lake and dug for roots in dry soil. After an hour, Nile's hands emerged, stained a reddish brown, the skin tight and already looking years older. Next came the callousing. Mathone produced a length of rough, knotted sisal rope. Rub your palms on this, she instructed, until they burn. Do it again tomorrow and the next day. We must build the memory of labor into your skin, where it can be seen and felt. It was painful, humiliating work. Nile's palms grew raw, then blistered. Mathone treated the blisters with a special salve that also darkened the skin, so the healing would leave behind rough, dark patches of false history. She taught Nile how to hold her hands, not loosely, but with a slight, permanent curl, as if they ached from a long day's grinding of grain. The Queen's posture was next. Mathone tied a light cord around Nile's waist, then attached it to a low hook in the wall. Now, walk, she said. The cord pulled Nile forward into a permanent, slight stoop, a burdened forward lean. She practiced walking like this for hours and hours, her back screaming in protest. She learned to look at the ground a few paces ahead, not at the distant horizon as she was used to. She practiced the tired sigh of a woman whose life is defined by wastewater jars, firewood, the immense weight of survival. Forget the glide, Mathone chided gently. Think of the shuffle, the scrape of a bare foot that is too tired to lift properly. Think of the sigh that comes not from sorrow, but from the simple, daily exhaustion of carrying. In the close, herbal-scented dark of the storeroom, the only sounds were the scrape of Nile's practicing feet, her controlled breaths of effort, and Mathone's soft, constant corrections. The Queen was disappearing. In her place, muscle by muscle, sigh by sigh, was emerging a new woman named Akchek, a hypothetical widow from a lakeside village, her beauty worn down by sun and labor, her spirit bent under the weight of the everyday. Finally, Mathone worked on Nile's face. She used subtle mixtures of charcoal and clay to create the faint, permanent squint lines of one who spends her days looking into sun-reflected water. She taught her to relax the regal set of her jaw, to let her mouth soften into a neutral, unsmiling line of pure endurance. She dulled the fierce, intelligent light in Nile's eyes by having her stare at a smoky lamp for long periods, teaching her a gaze that was weary, slightly unfocused, and turned inward. By the end of a week, if one of Nile's own courtiers had passed her in a dim corridor, they would not have recognized her. The transformation was not a costume. It was an engraving of a new identity upon the royal body. Her hands were now hands of earth, not of ivory. Her walk was a journey of burden, not a procession of power. She had learned to see like a commoner, and now she had learned to wear their skin. The vessel was ready. Now they had to decide what of the kingdom was precious enough and portable enough to be carried within it. Beneath the palace, in a cellar known only to the monarch and the master of the royal forge, the last council of the old kingdom convened. This wasn't a meeting held in a grand, sunlit hall, but in a small room that smelled of damp earth, old metal, and heavy secrets. There were only 4 people present. Queen Nile, now hidden behind the face and weary posture of a common woman named Akek. With her was Mathone, the elder, her face a map of worries. Then there was Gatura, the master smith, a man whose powerful arms were corded like the ancient roots of a baobab tree. And finally, Adhimbo, the master basket weaver, an old woman whose frail fingers seemed to remember the shape of every single reed that ever grew by the lake. Before them, laid out on a rough woolen cloth, were the sacred regalia of the kingdom, the crown of the deep waters, a stunning, complex lattice of gold wires and shimmering freshwater pearls, the scepter of the flowing source, a heavy rod of ironwood topped with a fist-sized, uncut emerald that pulsed with a faint green light, the orb of the still sky, a perfect, polished sphere of deep blue lapis lazuli, and the shield of the ancestors, a heavy disc of bronze, inlaid with a spiraling pattern of copper and ivory that told the story of their people. These were not just symbols. They were more than just objects of wealth and power. They were the crystallized contract between the people, the land, and the spirit of the monarchy itself. To lose them was to lose the very soul of the kingdom. But to be caught with them, under the new regime, was certain death. Gatura, the smith, was the first to break the tense silence. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "They are looking for these," he said, his gaze sweeping over the treasures. "They will tear this palace apart stone by stone, until they find them. We cannot hide them as they are. We must make them into what they are not." And so, the disassembly began. It felt like a sacrilege, a quiet, systematic dismantling of 1,000 years of history, of continuity. Each movement was deliberate, each sound echoing with the weight of what they were doing. With a heart-breaking reverence, Gatura took the scepter of the flowing source. Using tools finer than those a watchmaker might use, he searched for the hidden seams known only to his lineage of smiths. With a series of precise twists and pulls, the solid ironwood rod separated into 3 smaller, unremarkable sections. They looked like nothing more than simple walking sticks. Then he carefully pried the great emerald from its setting. Taking a common gourd, he hollowed it out, placed the magnificent gem inside, and sealed the opening with dark, melted wax. Just like that, the scepter's heart became a simple medicine gourd, the kind any traveling herbalist might carry. Next, Adhimabo, the weaver, turned her attention to the crown of the deep waters. With fingers as steady as the passage of time itself, she began to unstring it. The pearls and small golden beads, one by one, were collected and dropped into a small leather pouch. The delicate gold wires, the very framework of the crown, she carefully straightened and coiled. "These will be the ribs of a special basket," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. "They will give it strength. They will remember their shape." The symbol of royal authority was now just a handful of crafting supplies. The orb of the still sky presented the most perilous challenge. Its perfect, recognizable shape could not be altered without shattering it. But Adhembo was prepared. She produced a lump of black beeswax and a length of common, dirty cloth. With methodical care, she coated the entire lapis lazuli sphere in a thick layer of wax. Then she wrapped it tightly in the cloth, molding the wax and fabric into the lumpy, irregular shape of a large root vegetable yam or a cassava, destined for the market. The flawless sky stone was now just a misshapen bundle wrapped in rags. The shield of the ancestors was the largest problem. It was too big, too iconic. Gatura solved it with fire and hammer. In the cellar's small forge, he heated the bronze shield just enough to make it malleable, its ancestral spiral glowing a dull red in the dim light. Then, with a series of brutal, efficient blows, he flattened the magnificent design into a featureless, bent sheet of metal. He hammered it further, folding it into the rough, ugly shape of a broken plowshare, the kind a poor farmer might carry to the smith for repair. The shield that had witnessed 1,000 sunrises was now an object of pity, not of awe. Let's pause for a moment and take in this scene. The sacred objects, the very heart of the kingdom, are gone. In their place on the cloth lie the pieces of a grim, scattered puzzle. 3 walking sticks, a dirty bundle, a small pouch of beads, a coil of wire, and a broken piece of a plough. The air in the cellar is thick with the grief of this transformation. Niall feels a physical pain in her chest, a sharp ache, as if her own ribs were being taken apart and repurposed. But she does not weep. This is the price she must pay for the kingdom's heartbeat. It must learn to beat in secret, in pieces, hidden in plain sight. Niall's task was the most intimate, the most personal. From a hidden compartment in the wall of her chamber, she retrieved the 2 ultimate treasures of the monarchy. First, the seal of the kingdom, a carved hematite cylinder used to stamp all official decrees with the monarch's authority. And second, the Shuya gem, also known as the heart of the lake. It was a ruby the size of a child's thumb, believed to hold the very spirit of the founding queen. These she would carry on her own person. The heavy hematite seal was carefully sewn into the thick, padded shoulder of the coarse linen dress she would wear in her disguise. The Shuya gem, the kingdom's fiery soul, found its new home hidden within the labyrinthine waistband of her underskirt, a hard, secret knot pressing against her skin, a constant, private reminder of who she truly was and what she was fighting for. The disassembly was complete. Power had been fragmented, its radiant aura dissolved into the mundane. What remained on the woolen cloth was a collection of innocent, worthless-looking objects. Anyone who found them would see only junk, the possessions of a poor traveler. The first and most painful act of the great disguise was over. Now they needed the containers, the people, the journeys that would make these fragments disappear into the stream of everyday life, scattering them across the land until the day they could be brought together again. Adhembo's hands were her mind. They thought in tension and space, in the logic of warp and weft. In a sunlit corner of her weaving hut, far from the palace's anxious heart, she laid out her materials. There were reeds soaking in water to make them pliant. There were strands of tough, fibrous bark from the muqua tree, ready to lend their strength. And there were the coiled gold wires from the crown, now straightened and dulled with a paste of river clay and ash. She worked in a focused silence, her world distilled to the materials before her and the urgent task at hand. Her language was not of words, but of motion. It was the soft shushtik of the reeds as she began the base of the first basket. To any observer, it looked like a common, round market basket, the kind used to carry vegetables from the field or fish from the river. But as Niall watched, she saw the subtle genius take shape. The base was not a simple spiral. Adhembo was weaving a double layer, creating a hollow space between them, a secret compartment no thicker than 2 fingers. Into this space, as she continued to weave, she slipped the flattened, hammered remains of the shield, which was now just a misshapen sheet of metal. It lay flat and silent, sandwiched between 2 layers of identical, innocent reedwork, its formidable history completely erased by the humble disguise. The strength is in the tension, Adhembo murmured, her voice a low hum against the rustle of the reeds. Her eyes never left her flying fingers. The gold wires, they go here as ribs. She began weaving the clay-smeared gold wires vertically into the basket's sides. They provided a hidden rigidity, a memory of circularity that would make the basket unusually strong and perfectly round. But to a casual glance, they were indistinguishable from darker, thicker reeds. "A good basket holds its shape," she added softly. "No one questions why. The brilliance was in its plausibility. A well-made basket was a sign of a good weaver, nothing more. The hidden strength of the kingdom's crown would be mistaken for simple quality craftsmanship. The second basket was designed for the gourd. This one was a tall, cylindrical carrier with a tightly fitting lid. As she wove, Adhyambo created a false interior bottom, forming a deep, stable well in the bottom third of the basket. Here, the orb, carefully wrapped in wax and cloth to protect it, would sit, nestled and immobile. The top 2/3 of the basket would be filled with common, smelly, dried fish. The powerful odor served a dual purpose. It was a legitimate cargo for such a container, and it would ensure any curious hand would not dare to dig too deep. She wove the lid with a complex, locking weave. It looked simple, but it required a specific, counterintuitive twist to open a secret twist known only to her and now to Nile. The third basket was the most personal and perhaps the most intricate. It was a shallow, wide basket, the kind a woman might use for carrying freshly washed laundry to the river or for gleaning grain after the harvest. In its wide, sloped sides, Adhyambo wove a series of small, tubular pockets, each one seamlessly integrated into the structure. Into these, the unstrung pearls and golden beads from the crown were slid, 1 or 2 per pocket. Their slight weight was distributed evenly across the entire basket, making it feel perfectly balanced. The beads might make a sound, so she had a solution for that too. She lined each tiny pocket with soft kapok fiber, muting the precious contents until they were completely silent. The kingdom's treasury was now hidden in plain sight, dispersed within the very fabric of a laundry basket. As Nile watched Adhyambo's hands move with a lifetime of practice, she began to understand the profound logic behind the weaver's work. Each hidden space was defensible in its own unique way. The double base of the market basket was concealed by its identical mirrored weaving. The deep well in the fish basket was protected by a foul-smelling but perfectly legitimate cargo. The tubular pockets in the laundry basket were disguised as simple structural elements, part of the basket's design. Nothing was glued or tied in place. Everything was held by the relentless, intelligent pressure of the weave itself. To find the secrets hidden within, one would have to know exactly where to cut. And to cut the basket would be to destroy it, an unthinkable act for a soldier searching for gold and jewels, not for damaged reeds and ruined fish. The baskets were their own best defense. "The basket is a story," Adhyambo said, finally looking up at Nile. Her eyes were milky with age, but sharp with an unyielding understanding. "The outside of the story is market, fish, laundry. The inside of the story is kingdom. A good story does not draw attention to its hidden meaning. It invites you to see only the surface." She paused, letting her words settle in the quiet air of the hut. "You must carry these stories now. You must believe the surface so that others will too." It was a lesson not just in concealment, but in performance. Nile had to become the woman who carried these baskets. Her mind focused on the market, the river, the field, so that no one would ever guess at the true weight she carried. Let's pause for a moment and truly appreciate the scene. In the quiet hut, the 3 completed baskets sit innocently on the earthen floor. They are beautiful in their craftsmanship, but utterly ordinary. They are the kind of objects you would see in any village, in any home, used for the daily tasks of life. Yet, they hold the physical soul of a nation, disguised as the simple tools of women's work. The true genius is not just in the hiding, but in the complete integration. The kingdom is not merely in the baskets. It has become the baskets. The shield is now the foundation of a market carrier. The crown is the skeleton of that same carrier. The orb is the hidden core of a fish basket. The treasury is the silent, distributed weight in a laundry basket. It's an act of profound alchemy, transforming symbols of power into objects of utter humility. In the days that followed, Nile practiced. This was the next stage of her education. She practiced carrying them, getting used to their specific weights and how they felt. She learned the weight distribution, the way the market basket swung against her hip, the weary adjustment of the shoulders that a woman used to bearing heavy loads would make without thinking. She practiced a specific twist for the lid of the fish basket until it became muscle memory, an absent-minded gesture she could perform without a flicker of hesitation. She lifted and shook the laundry basket, feeling the slight, distributed rattle of the beads. Committing that faint sound to memory, it was the sound of her crown, now just a whisper in woven grass. The education in disguise was complete. It had moved from the abstract knowledge of a queen to the physical embodiment of a common woman, carrying her world in 3 simple baskets. While Adhiambo focused on weaving the large containers, the most crucial and smallest treasures became the responsibility of Nile and Muthoni. They worked in the Queen's chamber, now stark and empty, stripped of its rich tapestries, already looking like a ghost of its former self. Here, in this private, echoing space, they performed the final, most intimate acts of concealment. The first treasure was the seal of the kingdom. It was a cylinder of cool, dense hematite, heavy with the weight of authority. Muthoni took the simple, coarse, undyed linen dress that Nile would wear on her journey. She carefully unpicked a small section of the seam at the shoulder, a place where the fabric was already doubled and gathered for strength, providing natural padding. Using a fine, curved needle and thread that perfectly matched the linen, she crafted a small, tight pocket within the shoulder's padding itself. Once the pocket was ready, the hematite seal was slipped inside. Muthoni then sewed the seam back together. Her stitches were so perfect, so tiny and precise, that the alteration was completely invisible, indistinguishable from the original work. The added weight was slight, feeling natural, like a worn patch or a seam that had thickened over time. As she knotted the thread and bit it off with her teeth, a gesture of finality, Muthoni spoke softly. "The shoulder carries burden," she said. "This is just another kind of weight. You will get used to it. It will become part of you." The weight of the kingdom now rested literally on Nile's shoulder, a secret she alone would carry. Next was the Shuya gem, the heart of the lake. This was a far more dangerous object to hide. Its shape was distinctive, and its discovery would immediately reveal Nile's royal identity. For this, they turned to Nile's underskirt, a simple garment made of slightly softer cotton. It had a wide, folded waistband, and Muthoni showed Nile how to unpick a short section of the inner hem. Inside, she revealed a narrow tunnel that ran the entire circumference of the waistband. This would be the hiding place. "We must not put it all in one place," Muthoni instructed, her voice low and serious. She then produced a handful of smooth, grey river pebbles, all chosen because they were roughly the same size and shape as the magnificent ruby. "You will sew these in first, spaced apart," she explained. "To anyone who touches it, they will feel like simple beads or knots in the fabric, nothing unusual or suspicious. Then, among them, you will sew the Shuya. Its setting is gone. It is just a stone now. It will be the red pebble in a stream of grey ones. If a hand feels the waistband, it will feel many small, hard lumps. Only you will know which one is the heart of our people." Niall's hands, once soft and accustomed to embroidery and fine arts, were now rough and stained from hard work. She struggled with the delicate needlework required for this task. Her first stitches were uneven and clumsy. Without a word of reproach, Mathone simply made her unpick them and start again. "This is not a queen's tapestry," the old woman said, her tone not unkind, but firm with the gravity of their situation. "But it is the most important stitching you will ever do. It must be perfect. It must be invisible. The life of your lineage is in these threads." And so, under the flickering, unsteady light of a single oil lamp, Niall sewed. The small flame cast long, dancing shadows on the walls of the bare room as she worked. She placed each cool, grey pebble into the cloth tunnel of the waistband, spacing them evenly, her focus absolute. With tiny, almost obsessive stitches, she sewed the hem closed over them. Her fingers grew sore, but she persisted, redoing any stitch that was less than perfect. When it was time for the shuya, she paused. She held the gem in the palm of her hand. In the lamplight, it pulsed with a deep crimson fire, a living ember that seemed to hold the warmth of the entire kingdom within its facets. It was a farewell. She brought it to her lips and kissed it lightly, a silent goodbye to its public life as a symbol of royalty. Then, with a deep breath, she slid it into the tunnel, nestled securely between two ordinary grey pebbles. She sewed the fabric over it, her needle moving with newfound precision. As the final stitch closed, the magnificent gem disappeared from the world, its vibrant light extinguished by a layer of simple cotton. It became just another anonymous lump in a poor woman's undergarment, its true value known only to the woman who wore it. Let's pause here for a moment and take in this scene. The oil lamp gutters, its flame weak, as if exhausted by the night's long work. Niall ties off the last thread, her task complete. She runs her fingers slowly along the waistband of the underskirt. It feels like a string of prayer beads, a mundane, personal rosary. Each small lump is a secret. On the back of a simple wooden chair lies the dress, its shoulder now carrying the hidden weight of the kingdom's seal. The transformation is profound, and it is complete. The Queen's body has become a living archive. Her simple garments are now a camouflaged reliquary, holding the most sacred relics of her people. She is dressed in her own history, but disguised as poverty itself. Her regalia is no longer gold and silk, but secrets and sorrow, woven into the very fabric she wears. But the physical preparations were only half the battle. The final, and perhaps most difficult, preparation was the story. A new identity had to be crafted, one that was as strong and seamless as the stitches in her dress. Mathone became her teacher, drilling her relentlessly. Niall was to become a Czech, the widow of a fisherman from the southern shore. Her village had been burned in the conflict, and she was now a refugee, making her way to a distant town to seek shelter with a supposed cousin. They invented every detail of this new life. They gave the cousin a name, a profession, a personality. They fleshed out the burned village with streets and landmarks, giving Niall memories that were not her own but felt just as real. They decided on a specific manner of speaking. Niall, the Queen, had to learn to flatten her vowels, to clip her words, to use the simpler grammar and dialect of the lakeside folk. She practiced for hours, her royal accent slowly giving way to a rougher, more common cadence. The fiction had to be more than just memorized. It had to be worn as comfortably and naturally as the dress on her back. It had to become her truth. So, when the dawn of their planned exodus was still a distant, pale promise in the sky, everything was finally ready. The body was disguised. The treasures were disassembled and hidden away in plain sight, scattered amongst humble baskets and simple cloth. The story The new identity of Akek was memorized and rehearsed until it was second nature. All that remained was the waiting. Waiting for the signal, that quiet confirmation that the path was clear. And then she would have to find the courage to walk out of the palace, to leave behind the only life she had ever known, carrying its very essence secretly on her back, around her waist, and in the sound of her voice. She was no longer just a queen. She was a vessel, a secret history walking into an unknown future. The night of their exodus was moonless, a deliberate blessing of thick, velvety darkness. Yet, a completely silent escape was an impossible dream. 6 people, Neil Mathoni, Keturah, the smith, Adhimbo, the weaver, and Niall's 2 young nieces, girls of 6 and 8, who were the very last of the direct bloodline, could not simply vanish from a besieged palace. Their absence would be noticed within the hour, triggering an immediate and thorough search that would seal their fate before they ever reached the city walls. They needed more than just darkness and quiet. They needed a diversion, a loud, glorious, and utterly convincing lie to cover the quiet truth of their flight. Keturah, the aging but still powerful smith, was the architect of this grand deception. In the final, tense hour before midnight, he gathered a small, select group of the oldest, most loyal palace guards. These were men who had served the throne their entire lives, men who knew they would not be leaving, whose final, sworn duty was to become a brave footnote in the kingdom's history. He gave them their instructions, his voice a low rumble in the torchlit armory. Their performance had to be perfect. They were to stage a surrender. At the exact stroke of the time when the enemy's night watch was known to be at its wariest. The great main gates of the palace compound, which had been barred and silent for weeks, groaned open. Not wide, just a crack, just enough for a desperate plea to slip through. From within, a small, sorrowful procession emerged into the no man's land between the walls. The old guards, their ceremonial armor polished one last time to catch the firelight, carried not weapons, but the empty, gilded cases that had once cradled the royal regalia. They carried the torn, sacred banners of the kingdom, letting them drag in the dust as a sign of utter defeat. Leading them was a man carefully chosen for his resemblance to the palace Chamberlaina Minor Courtier, an actor of sorts, for this final, tragic play who walked with a pronounced, heartbreaking stoop of defeat. They moved with a slow, deliberate solemnity, a funeral march towards the enemy's central command fire. As the first challenge rang out from the nearest sentry, the false chamberlain cried out, his voice artfully broken but pitched to carry across the field. "We yield. The queen is dead of fever. We yield the palace and its treasures. Spare those who remain." It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a perfectly crafted piece of misdirection. The news, the queen dead, the siege won, the treasures offered up for the taking was irresistible catnip to the weary conquerors. A moment of stunned silence was followed by a roar of triumph that erupted from the enemy camp. It was a wave of pure, unrestrained elation. Men streamed from their tents and their posts, abandoning their discipline, all rushing towards the main gate. They flocked towards the spectacle of surrender, drawn by the irresistible promise of easy plunder and the glorious end to a long, hard campaign. Drums, captured from the palace stores weeks earlier, were brought out and beaten in a raucous, discordant celebration of victory. The noise was tremendous, a chaotic symphony of shouts, cheers, and drumming that washed over the entire western side of the palace compound, blanketing everything in its jubilant sound. From the deep shadows of a ruined garden wall, tucked away near the despised Midden Gate, Niall and her 5 companions listened. They huddled together, frozen in place. The sound of the false surrender was their clock, their cover, their heartbreaking soundtrack. Every triumphant cheer from the enemy was another nail in the coffin of her old life, her old identity. The celebratory drums were the funeral dirge for her reign, for the kingdom her ancestors had built. She felt Mathoni's firm, weathered hand on her arm, a silent command not to weep, not to falter, not now. This deafening noise was the price of their silence. This public, staged death of her kingdom was the necessary payment for their secret, continued life. The diversion worked more perfectly than they could have dared to hope. The lone sentry at the forgotten Midden Gate, who only moments before had been pacing his short, boring route, was now leaning heavily on his spear, craning his neck, desperate to see the commotion at the far-off main gate. His post was forgotten. History, it seemed, was happening elsewhere, and he was missing it. The predictable, disciplined pattern of enemy patrols dissolved into the general, disorganized rush towards the center of the noise. The entire western flank of the palace was a swirling vortex of celebration, leaving the eastern side, the side of refuse and shadows, utterly neglected. This was the moment Gatara had planned for. The stage was now set. The eyes and ears of the entire enemy army were turned towards a brilliant, tragic fiction playing out under the firelight. And in the profound, unnoticed shadow created by that fiction, the truth in the form of a weary widow who was once a queen. An old aunt who was her only confidant, a loyal craftsman, a steadfast weaver, and two sleepy, terrified children prepared to slip out through the gate of garbage. They were leaving behind a burning pyre of lies, stepping out from the wreckage of their past and into the terrifying, absolute unknown. Their kingdom was dead. Long live the survivors. They moved like ghosts. Mathoni went first, her movements practiced and silent, a shadow melting into deeper shadows. She carried one of the sleeping children, the girl's head lolling against her shoulder. Gatara followed, his large frame surprisingly nimble, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then came Nile, holding her other niece's small, trembling hand. The girl was awake, her eyes wide with a fear too deep for tears. Nile squeezed her hand gently, a silent reassurance she herself did not feel. Adhyambo the weaver came last, her tall, thin figure a final sliver of darkness disappearing through the gate. She pulled the heavy wooden gate closed behind them, the soft thud of wood on stone lost in the distant cacophony. They were outside. The air tasted different here, thick with the smell of the marsh that bordered the city and the rot from the midden heap, but it was the air of freedom. For a few precious seconds, they stood frozen, listening. The enemy's celebration continued, unabated. No alarm had been raised. No one had noticed 6 figures slipping out like rats from a sinking ship. They were insignificant, invisible. Their path lay away from the main roads, through the treacherous marshlands that the besieging army had deemed impassable. Gatara had scouted this route weeks ago, marking a trail with subtle signs only he could recognize: a notched reed here, a particular arrangement of stones there. It was their only chance. They carried almost nothing: a few skins of water, some dried meat and hard bread, a small pouch of medicinal herbs prepared by Mathoni, and the clothes on their backs. Their true treasure was not gold or jewels, but the 2 sleeping children who represented the future. The journey through the marsh was a new kind of hell. The ground sucked at their feet with every step. The air was alive with the drone of insects, and unseen things slithered in the brackish water around them. Nile's fine-caught slippers, never meant for such terrain, were ruined within minutes, the cold mud oozing between her toes. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, not from the discomfort, but from the sheer, overwhelming reality of her fall. Just yesterday, she had walked on polished marble floors. Today, she waded through filth. The younger niece, held tight in Nile's arms now, whimpered in her sleep. Niall pressed her face into the child's hair, breathing in her scent, a grounding anchor in a world that had spun off its axis. This was why she was doing this. Not for herself, her life had ended the moment the enemy breached the outer walls, but for them. For these two girls who deserved to grow up, to laugh, to live without knowing the weight of a lost crown. Mathone moved ahead, a steady, tireless presence. She had been Niall's mother's confidant, and then Niall's. She was the repository of their family's history, of its strength. She never complained, never hesitated. Her silence was a fortress, her unwavering focus a beacon for them all. Beside her, Gutterer used his smith's strength to push aside thick reeds and test the ground ahead, ensuring a safe path. Even Adhayambo, the weaver, whose hands were made for delicate threads, showed a surprising resilience, her long limbs moving with a quiet grace through the grasping vegetation. Hours passed. The sounds of the celebrating army faded behind them, replaced by the symphony of the swamp at night. The false dawn began to streak the sky with shades of grey and pale rose when they finally reached solid ground on the other side of the marsh. They collapsed behind a cluster of ancient, gnarled trees, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. They had made it through the first, most dangerous part of their escape. Niall looked back in the direction of the city. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, a phantom limb that still ached. She thought of the old guards who had given their lives for this chance, of the false chamberlain whose name she didn't even know. They had bought this future with their blood. She would not let their sacrifice be in vain. She looked at her nieces, now sleeping soundly on a bed of dry leaves, their faces peaceful in the growing light. They were the seeds of a new beginning, carried away from the ashes of the old world. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it was a road that led towards life, not death. The Midden Gate wasn't made of wood and iron. It was a low, arched opening in the base of the stockade wall, a place where the daily refuse was pushed out. Food scraps, ash, soiled reeds, all of it shoved through to be collected or simply left to rot. The air around it hung thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. It was like the mouth of the palace's body, spitting out whatever it no longer needed. Tonight, it would spit out its very soul. Gutterer was the first to go. He'd swapped his smith's leather apron for the tattered hide of a donkey driver. He slipped out into the deep darkness beyond the wall, moving with a predator's silence that completely contradicted his large frame. His job was simple but crucial. Make sure the path was clear for a count of 50 breaths. He didn't carry a weapon. Instead, he held a small, pungent sack of rotten fruit pulp. If anyone challenged him, he was just a scavenger, looking for scraps to feed his pigs. Those 50 breaths felt like a lifetime. From inside, pressed against the cold, wet stones, Niall could hear only two things: the distant, muffled roar of the false surrender happening at the main gate, and the frantic, thunderous beating of her own heart. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping sound from outside. It was Katora, dragging the donkey cart into position. That was the signal. Adhayambo went next, guiding the two young girls. Their small hands clutched hers tightly. The children had been given a bitter, mild sedative tea, just enough to make them drowsy and compliant. They moved like sleepy ghosts, their eyes wide but unfocused, their steps shuffling. Adhayambo, the basket weaver, now carried her own masterpiece, large laundry basket, its contents far more precious than simple linens. To any observer, she was just a grandmother, fleeing the chaos with her grandchildren and their few pitiful possessions. Then it was Niall's turn, with Mathone a step behind her. Niall adjusted the straps of the two key baskets she carried. The market basket with the hidden shield piece was on her back, while the fish basket containing the precious orb hung from her hand. The weight was familiar now. It was the weight of a Kek's life, the weight of their future. She took a deep breath, a breath that smelled of rot and freedom, ducked her head low, and stepped through the arch. The world outside was a pool of ink. The cold, thick mud of the drainage ditch immediately seeped between her bare toes. Directly in front of her stood Gatura's donkey cart, piled high with the actual, smelly refuse from the palace kitchens. It was a perfect olfactory shield, a wall of stench that would deter anyone from getting too close. Gatura himself was a slumped silhouette standing at the donkey's head. Without a single word, they fell into formation. Gatura led the donkey, and the cart's wheels began to creak a slow, mournful rhythm. At Hyambo and the girls walked directly behind the cart, completely hidden in its shadow and its overwhelming smell. Niall and Mathone followed a few paces behind them, purposefully separate, as if they were unrelated stragglers who just happened to be using the cover of the cart's passage. They didn't walk on the main path. Instead, they moved through the soggy, untended ground beside it, where feet would not naturally go, where their tracks would be harder to find. Their pace was agonizingly slow. It was the pace of a tired beast and burdened refugees. It was the pace of insignificance. They moved away from the palace wall, but their destination wasn't the open country. Not yet. First, they headed towards a tangled grove of banana trees, a grove that had been fertilized by the Midden's refuse for generations. The trees were thick, their broad leaves overlapping to create a darkness even deeper than the night itself. This was their first veil of cover. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine being there under those banana leaves. The world shrinks. The only sounds are the squelch of mud underfoot, the donkey's soft snort, the ragged, shallow breathing of the children. The distant celebration, the fake surrender, is now just a filtered, muffled nightmare, its sound deadened by a wall of vegetation. In this moment, they are like insects crawling away from a burning log, completely unseen, unthought of, beneath the notice of the predators. They are ghosts in the making. They made their way through the grove and followed a sunken animal track, passing a stagnant pond where the frogs fell silent as they approached. Gatura knew this land intimately. He had hunted here as a boy. He wasn't navigating by the stars. He was leading them by the memory of the land's body, the subtle dip that led to a dry stream bed, the stand of whistling thorn trees that marked the old boundary of the royal cattle pasture. Every single step took them further away from the world of palaces and crowns, and deeper into the primal world of roots, water, and pure survival. They did not speak. Not a single word was uttered. Their communication was entirely through touch. A hand placed gently on an arm to signal a halt, a pointed finger to indicate a change in direction. The children, mercifully drowsy from the tea, stumbled occasionally but never cried out. The night simply absorbed them. The grand diversion back at the main gate was a roaring bonfire, a spectacle of noise and light designed to draw every eye. But they were the faintest trail of smoke, drifting away on an unfelt breeze. The path of the unseen is never a road. It's a seam in the fabric of the night, stitched together with silence and the smell of garbage. It's the path of those who refuse to be erased. The hardest part was not the darkness, nor the rough ground, nor the weight of the baskets. It was the soundtrack. As they put more and more distance between themselves and the palace, the nature of that distant noise began to change. What started as shouts of surprise and triumph slowly solidified into a steady, rhythmic thrum of occupation. They could no longer make out individual words, but they could hear the pattern. The victorious drums had taken up a new, foreign beat. They could hear, or maybe it was just their imagination, the crash of doors being broken open inside Niall's home. They could picture the splintering of her furniture for firewood, hear the coarse laughter echoing through her courtyards. Each single drumbeat that echoed from the captured palace felt like a footstep on her own heart. Each distant, faint cheer was like a lash across her back. Nile just kept walking, her body bowed under the heavy baskets, her bare feet cut and bleeding from stones and thorns. But the true pain, the real agony, was behind her. It radiated from that glowing hilltop where her entire life was being systematically unmade, piece by painful piece. Mathone, walking right beside her, sensed the depth of her agony. At one point, as a particularly loud crescendo of drums and shouts rolled across the darkened plains, she reached out and took Nile's hand. It wasn't the hand of a subject touching their queen. It was the hand of an elder steadying a grieving daughter. Her grip was dry and sure, a small anchor in the storm of noise. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her touch communicated everything. This is the price. This sound, this horrible, triumphant noise, is the currency with which we are buying our future. Listen to it. Pay it. And Nile did listen. She forced herself to listen. She began to match her own plodding, desperate steps to the rhythm of the enemy's celebration. That terrible sound became her metronome. With every boom of their drum, she placed one foot forward. With every shout, she took another breath. She was turning their victory song into the marching cadence of her own escape. It was a profound act of spiritual alchemy, transforming the very sound of her defeat into the engine of her survival. She was forging strength from the source of her pain, refusing to let it break her. The children, nestled in their makeshift slings, began to whimper. They were awakened by the chill in the air and a deep sense of fear they could unpossibly name but felt all the same. Adhimbo, ever watchful, hushed them with quiet snippets of a weaving song. Her soft voice was a fragile countermelody to the brutal, pounding drums in the distance. Up at the front of their small, desperate column, Gatara never once looked back. His shoulders were set like a wall against the world they were leaving behind. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, on finding the next fold in the land, the next dip in the terrain that could hide them from prying eyes. They walked for hours that stretched into what felt like days. The landscape slowly began to shift around them. The familiar, cultivated fields of the kingdom gave way to dense reed beds. Then their feet felt the first soft, sucking mud of the lake's vast marshes. And with that change in terrain came another, more welcome change. The sound of the palace, that constant, oppressive drumming, finally began to fade. It was as if the immense, silent absorbency of the water and the chirping of the night insects were swallowing it whole. The drums became a memory, then a faint ghost on the edge of hearing, and then, finally, nothing at all. They stopped at the edge of the reeds. They had reached the spot where a fisherman's dugout canoe was hidden, just as had been prearranged weeks before. The silence that replaced the drums was overwhelming, almost deafening in its own way. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a silence of rupture, the sound of a world left behind, a history being erased. They had literally walked out of the sound of their own lives being dismantled. Now there was only the gentle lap of black water against the reeds, the distant cry of a night bird, and the immense, terrifying quiet of freedom. They had escaped. But as Nile stood there, looking out at the dark, endless water stretching before them, she knew this walk was far from over. It was just one part of a much longer journey. They had walked away from the drums of conquest, yes, but now they had to walk, or rather paddle, into the absolute unknown. They were heading into a future where the only sounds would be the ones they themselves made. The only kingdom they had now was the one they carried in their baskets, in the hems of their clothes, and most importantly, in their hearts. That was the kingdom that could never be conquered, the one they would now have to rebuild, one paddle stroke at a time, in the vast, waiting silence. The fisherman's hut was less a home and more a skeleton. Its walls, woven from reeds and patched with mud, barely stood. The roof, a thatch of papyrus, was full of holes pecked by egrets. The floor was just hard-packed earth. This place, perched on stilts at the edge of a remote, mist-shrouded lagoon, felt secretive and still. The air hung heavy with the smell of dead fish, damp bird feathers, and a deep, profound loneliness. For the first 3 days, their lives were a simple, raw cycle of survival. They slept, they ate the dried fish from their baskets, making sure to avoid the hidden orb, and they tended to their wounds. There were the physical ones, cuts on their feet, blisters on their hands. But there were also the deeper, invisible wounds etched into their spirits. The children, still so young, would cry for their mothers and the comfort of their soft beds. And Hyambo and Gatara, ever the craftsmen, worked in a determined silence to make the hut more habitable. Their skilled hands, once used for grander things, were now mending fishing nets and fixing a broken door hinge. They were bringing order to the chaos, one small act at a time. Meanwhile, Nile sat by the water's edge, a solitary figure watching the grey dawns bleed into equally grey days. She was a queen without subjects, a ruler without a kingdom. The heavy baskets, now empty of the food that had disguised their true cargo, were no longer a burden. But another weight remained, the royal seal pressed against her shoulder, the pebbles in her pocket, the Shuhar gem hidden in her waistband. They all felt like anchors tying her to a world that had drowned. They were constant, physical reminders of everything she had lost. Her past was a ghost that haunted her every waking moment. On the 4th morning, as Nile sat in her usual spot, lost in thought, Muthoni found her. The elder woman was holding a piece of driftwood. It had been washed smooth and white by the lake, its shape curiously elegant, like a leaping fish frozen in midair. Muthoni didn't say a word. She walked to the center of the hut's single room, to the clearest patch of the earthen floor. She placed the driftwood on the ground, standing it upright as if she were planting a seed. Then she turned to face Nile. Her old, stooped back straightened. The weariness that had clouded her face seemed to melt away, replaced by a look of ceremonial solemnity. In a clear, formal voice that felt almost absurdly out of place in that tiny, reeking hut, she announced, "The court is convened. Let the ruler take her seat." It was both a command and an act of the most desperate, beautiful theater. Nile, understanding instantly what was happening, rose to her feet. She walked over to the piece of driftwood. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she placed her hand upon its smooth, cool surface. In that simple touch, she didn't feel wood, she felt the ghost of her sceptre's familiar weight, the responsibility it carried, the deep connection to her land and her lineage that flowed through it. Muthoni then declared to the others, who had all stopped their tasks to watch this strange ceremony unfold. "This is the scepter of the returning tide." Her voice filled the small space with a newfound power. It reminds us that what has ebbed will always flow back. It is made from the lake's own bones, given back to us. It is our authority here. And just like that, the kingdom began to reassemble itself, not from gold or precious stone, but from metaphor and meaning. The driftwood scepter was the first piece of this new reality. Gatara, catching the spirit of the moment, found a large, flat stone that rang with a clear, true note when he struck it. "This is the council's stone," he announced, placing it by the doorway. "All who speak here shall speak truth that rings clear." At Hyambo, not to be left out, took the empty market basket, the very one that had once hidden her shield. She carefully lined it with fresh, green reeds. "This is the basket of bounty," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. It will hold our catch, our gathered food. It feeds the court. Its true strength is hidden, but it is always present. It was a perfect, poignant metaphor for their own situation. Their strength was not in what was seen, but in what they held together, hidden from the world. Even the children were drawn into this creation myth. The older girl, Kessie, found a large, pearlescent mussel shell, its surface shimmering with soft colors. Mathone took it from her gently. This, she intoned with gravity, is the chalice of the moon's tears. She filled it with water from the lagoon and handed it first to Nile. The queen drank, and then the chalice was passed around for each person to take a sip. It was a simple ritual, but it was powerful. It was a ritual of shared sustenance, of a community being reborn and reconsecrated right there on the muddy shore. Let's just pause here and think about what's happening. In this dilapidated hut, surrounded by the smell of decay, a new mythology is being born. Every mundane object is being redeemed, re-enchanted with a powerful new meaning. This isn't about rebuilding a physical kingdom of stone and steel. It's about reimagining it. The power of this new kingdom doesn't come from mined gems or forged metal. It comes from the symbolic resonance of their survival. It comes from the shared, unspoken agreement that this piece of driftwood, this ordinary stone, this simple shell, that they all matter in a profound and new way. It's an act of collective will, of creating a reality out of hope. As Nile watched this unfold, she felt the ice that had been locked around her heart for days finally begin to crack. This wasn't an act of surrender. It was an act of translation. Her throne wasn't lost. It had been smuggled out in a basket, and now it was being reassembled from the fragments of this new, harsh world. The crown jewels were there, too, not in a vault, but in the beads sewn into the basket she sat on. The sacred orb was still hidden amongst the dried fish. The shield was in the very ribs of the basket that had carried it. And her true sovereignty, her real power as a ruler, was not in a palace or an army. It was here, in this collective act of naming, in this stubborn, beautiful insistence that they were still a people. Still a court, even if their palace was a hut and their royal scepter was just a piece of water-bleached wood. It was the birth of a kingdom of the heart, a nation built on resilience and imagination. The court of driftwood and metaphor, huddled by the vast lake, desperately needed its own liturgy. The grand, state rituals they once knew back in the palace were now impossible. The libations poured from golden ewers. The ancient invocations chanted within the stone temple, those belonged to a life that was gone. Mathone, her voice firm with conviction, insisted they were also unsuited to their new reality. A tree transplanted, she would say, her eyes scanning their small, determined group, must grow new roots that drink from the new soil. Our rituals must drink from this lake. And so, the days began to take on a new, deliberate rhythm. It was a rhythm woven from the most mundane tasks of survival and the sacred, urgent need for order and meaning. Each morning, after they drew water from the lake's edge, it was not simply poured into a cooking pot. This was the moment for the first ritual, and Adhiambo, as the designated keeper of what they called the Basket of Bounty, would perform it. She would take the chalice of the moon's tears, a large, iridescent mussel shell, and dip it into the container of fresh water. In the quiet morning mist, her voice would rise, soft but clear, carrying over the gentle lapping of the waves. "Hear us, spirits of the deep and the reed," she would say. "We thank you for the gift of this day. As this shell holds water, simple and necessary, hold us. Keep our minds clear and our purpose fluid." Then she would pass the shell to each person in turn. To drink from it was to accept the day's duty. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement of their shared, fragile existence, a pact made with the dawn itself. Each person, from the eldest to the youngest, would cup their hands, feeling the cool water. A shared sacrament that bound them together. Even the act of fishing was transformed. It was no longer just a chore for survival. When Gatara or one of the others returned from the lake, their net heavy with a catch, the fish would be laid carefully beside the flat council stone near their shelter. Before the practical task of cleaning them began, Nile, their queen, would perform her part. She would place her hand flat on the cool stone, her touch grounding the moment in solemnity. "Life gives itself to life," she would say, her voice steady. "We receive this gift with respect and with the strength to continue our journey." It was a stark, honest prayer, a direct conversation between gratitude and necessity. It was a far cry from the elaborate, joyous harvest festivals of the palace. But here, on the shores of their exile, it felt more real, more true. The children, Kessie and little Ao, were not left out. They were given a vital and sacred duty, the gathering and sorting of shells. Their small, woven baskets became the treasuries of memory. Each type of shell was imbued with a specific meaning, a role in their new mythology. The tiny, spiraled snail shells were designated the whispers of the ancestors. The children were taught to hold them to their ears, to listen for the faint, sea-like sigh within, and to imagine the voices of those who came before them. The broad, flat clamshells were called the tablets of the unwritten. Upon their smooth surfaces, using a pointed stick, one could trace stories in the damp sand, plan the day's work, or draw symbols of hope. And a broken, sharp piece of an oyster shell was not discarded as useless. It was a fragment of protection, a potent reminder that even broken things have edges that can defend, that strength can be found in imperfection. One afternoon, Nile watched as Kessie, her young face a mask of serious concentration, approached Muthoni. Kessie presented the elder with a perfect, unbroken cowrie shell she had found. Muthoni took it, her weathered fingers turning it over and over, feeling its texture, admiring its form. After a moment of quiet contemplation, she held it up for the small court to see. "This," she announced, her voice resonating with significance, "is the seed of return." She pointed to its unique shape. Its shape is the shape of a doorway, a closed eye, a promise held tight. It is not for spending, it is for keeping. Then Muthoni handed the precious shell to Nile. The queen felt its smooth, porcelain-like surface against her palm. It had a tiny, perfect weight to it. A seed. It was not a coin from their lost realm, useless in this new world. It was something far more valuable, the potential of a new one, a physical embodiment of their hope for a future. It represented the idea that from this small, contained beginning, something great could one day grow. These shell rituals, these small, daily acts of invented ceremony, did something profound for their spirits. They transformed the relentless act of scavenging into a sacrament. The lake shore was no longer just a barren margin of existence, a place of exile. It became the very source of their new symbolic language, the provider of their holy objects and the backdrop for their sacred theater. Every meal they shared, every task they undertook, was threaded through with this new layer of meaning. It tied their desperate daily grind to a larger, self-created purpose. They were doing more than just surviving. They were practicing a new form of kingship, a new way of being a community. It was a leadership built not on inherited power or golden crowns, but on immediate gratitude for the smallest gifts, on a deeply felt shared responsibility for one another, and on the quiet, powerful poetry of found objects. On the shore of the Great Lake, surrounded by driftwood and shells, they were not just a lost queen and her court. They were the architects of a new world, building a kingdom from the simple, beautiful things the water offered up. Their reign was measured in shared sips of water, in grateful prayers over a fish. and in the weight of a single, perfect shell held in the hand. They were learning that true wealth wasn't what you owned, but what you chose to make sacred. As the immediate shock of what had happened began to fade, a new, deeper anxiety started to take root in Nile. It was the fear of forgetting. She was the last of her line, the only one left to carry the stories, the laws, the genealogies, everything that formed the very soul of her lost kingdom. Back in the palace, these histories were kept safe by scholars, sung aloud by griots, and carved into the stone walls of temples. But here, in this new, harsh reality, there was only her memory, the endless sand, and the water that would, sooner or later, wash everything away. One evening, as the sun bled a brilliant orange across the lake, she knew she had to begin. She found a patch of wet sand near the entrance of her hut and smoothed it out. With a sharp piece of reed in her hand, she didn't write. She drew. "Come," she said, her voice soft but clear, calling to the children. The adults, drawn by her tone, gathered close as well. "This isn't a lesson for rulers," she explained, looking at their curious faces. "It's a story for all of us, because we are all that is left of it." She drew a great circle in the sand. "This," she declared, "is the lake at the beginning." Then she drew a smaller circle inside it, connecting the two with a single line. "And this is the spring of fresh thought, where our first mother, Lyra, drank." She sketched a simple figure next to it. Lyra saw that the people of the shore were divided. They were afraid of the deep water and the spirits they believed lived within it. So she took a boat made of reeds. As she spoke, her hand moved with a purpose it hadn't felt in a long time. She told the story of the first queen, not as a dry list of names and dates, but as a living series of choices and sacrifices. She drew the spear of union that brought the clans together. She depicted the giving of the names, the moment their people found their identity. She etched the sacred pact with the crocodile, a symbol of their bond with nature. With each new part of the tale, she added another symbol to the sand. The story unfolded before them, becoming a map, a constellation of their history drawn right at their feet. The simple, powerful image of circles, lines, stick figures glowed in the twilight. The intent faces of the children, Kessie and Ao, were lit by the last rays of the sun, their eyes wide as they watched their history being rendered in this fragile, impermanent medium. When she finally finished the tale, the patch of sand was a dense, beautiful tapestry of images. She looked down at it, this vulnerable record of her entire world. "This is us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This story is our root. But the lake will rise, or the wind will blow, and soon it will all be gone." Just then, Mathone, one of the elders, leaned forward. With a gentle finger, she reached down and erased a single line from the drawing, the shaft of the spear. She looked at the children, and what remains, she asked them. Kessie, the young girl, studied the altered picture carefully. "The people," she said, pointing a small finger, "and the crocodile's eye." "Good," Mathone said with a warm smile. "The story changes when a part is lost, but the heart of it remains. If you remember the heart, now it's your turn." She handed the reed to Kessie. "Draw the story back. Not exactly the same. Draw it as you remember it." Hesitantly at first, Kessie began to redraw the story in the sand. But she changed things. The boat she drew was larger, more robust. The queen's figure wasn't holding a spear. Instead, she held a fish, a symbol of provision. It wasn't correct, according to the official history, but it didn't matter. It was alive. It was her version, a story she had now internalized and made her own. Little Ao, not wanting to be left out, toddled forward and pressed a tiny, smooth shell into the sand to mark the crocodile's eye, adding his own small contribution to the tale. In that moment, Watching the children, Niall understood. This was how their lineage would survive. Not carved in immutable stone that could be destroyed, but in the constant, imperfect, and loving act of retelling. It would be drawn in sand, traced on clamshells that could be washed and reused, and whispered as bedtime stories under the stars. The permanence of their history wouldn't be found in the medium it was recorded on, but in the sacred ritual of transmission itself. It would live in the obligation of every listener to one day become the teller. The kingdom was no longer a place on a map. It was becoming a story they told each other to remember who they were. And a story, she realized, if it's carried in enough hearts, is the hardest thing in the entire world to erase. It becomes more resilient than stone, more enduring than any monument. It becomes a living part of the people themselves. That evening, as darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one, Niall felt the fear of forgetting finally begin to recede. In its place, a quiet, resilient hope began to grow, as enduring and as beautiful as the stories now being reborn in the sand. The season turned, the grey rains came, followed by the searing blue heat of the sun. The little fisherman's hut on the shore slowly became more solid, more permanent. It became a home. The simple routines they had established, the ones they called their court routines, drinking from a shell chalice, telling stories etched into the sand, became as natural and essential as breathing. One afternoon, Niall stood at the water's edge, feeling the familiar warmth of the Shuya gem in the pouch at her hip. The seal of the depths rested on her shoulder, a comforting, familiar weight. She looked back towards the hut, taking in the scene. Gatara was there, mending a fishing spear. His skills as a smith, once used for steel and fire, were now perfectly adapted to bone and flint. Adhyambo was weaving a new, larger basket, her fingers moving with a speed and grace that was mesmerizing. Deep within the weave, the hidden palace beads clicked softly, a secret rhythm only she could hear. And Mathoni, ever the teacher, was showing the children how to read the weather, not from charts or instruments, but from the elegant flight of the egrets across the sky. Looking at them, Niall realized they were not a queen and her servants living in exile. They were something far more powerful. They were a community. They were a people. For so long, she had believed that the Great Escape, the smuggling operation from the fallen city, had been about saving objects. She thought it was about the shield, the orb, the seal, the precious gems. But watching her friends now, seeing the life they were building, she finally understood the profound truth. The physical treasures, the regalia, they were just keys. They were the tangible touchstones for a transfer far greater, far more significant than she could have ever imagined. What had truly been smuggled out through the midden gate that fateful night was not the regalia of a state. It was the very syntax of a civilization. It was the grammar of their laws and their sense of mutual obligation to one another. Now spoken not in grand halls, but through the simple acts of sharing water and gathering fish. It was the poetry of their identity, no longer written on scrolls, but etched into shells and sand, told in stories under the stars. It was the rhythm of their rituals, beating now not to the sound of royal drums, but in the quiet, steady pulse of morning and evening chores. The palace of stone and timber was gone, lost to the enemy, but the pattern, the deep cultural pattern of who they were as a people, had been carried out safely. It was preserved in their minds, in the skill of their hands, and in their determined, storytelling hearts. The enemy had captured a hilltop. They had taken stone, timber, and gold things that could be broken, burned, or melted down. They had captured a narrative of victory, one they would shout to the world. But what they had taken was hollow. Niall, Adhyambo, Gatora, Mathoni, and the children. They had captured something real. They had captured a future. They held the living pattern of their culture. And a pattern is a powerful thing. A pattern can be imposed on anything: a simple hut, a vast lake shore, or even a new, undiscovered land waiting for them over the horizon. The kingdom was no longer a place you could find on a map. It had transformed. It was now a set of instructions for how to live, how to be, carried by the unseen, the intangible, the eternal. Niall bent down and picked up a cowrie shell from the damp sand at the water's edge. It was a new seed of return. She closed her hand around it, feeling its coolness, its perfect, smooth curve fitting into her palm. The shell held no magic, no ancient power. It held something better, the memory of a promise of survival, of renewal, of home. Looking out at the endless water, then back at her small, resilient family, she knew they were ready. The next journey, whatever it might be, could begin. You are now under Baobab skies. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you were moved by this story, please like, subscribe, and share so we can continue to explore these worlds together.